Okay, today we are going to start talking about section 2.9, which is dividing real numbers. Yesterday we talked about the reciprocal of numbers, so today is going to be really almost the same thing, just kind of looking at it a different way. So, kind of taking a step back, let's talk about the definition of division. Kind of like whenever we talked about the definition of subtraction and how I said subtracting is the same thing as adding the opposite. There's a way we can think of division in the same way, except instead of saying dividing by a number, it means the same thing to multiply by the reciprocal, which is what we talked about yesterday, the reciprocal of a number. Okay, so what that means is if I have a number A divided by a number B, instead of taking A divided by B, I could take A times the reciprocal of B, and yesterday we learned that the reciprocal of B is 1 over B, so just flipping that second number. That's going to come in really handy whenever we start talking about these fractions, okay? Before we move on to some examples, I want to go right back over those rules of multiplying and dividing positive and negative numbers, just so we kind of have it as a review. Just as a reminder, the rules for dividing are the exact same for multiplying. So if I have a positive number divided by a positive number, the answer is always going to be positive. If I have a positive number divided by a negative number, then that one is going to be negative. And if I have a negative divided by a positive, that one's also going to be negative. And if I have a negative divided by a negative, then that one flips around to be a positive. So always a good idea, just keep those in mind. And while we look at examples, hopefully we can remember those rules. So we'll do just a few practice examples. Okay, first one. Keep it simple. If I have 24 divided by a negative 3. Okay, there's really nothing special about this, right? We have 24 divided by a negative 3. If we are really confident in our multiplication or our facts, 24 divided by 3 we know is 8. And the only thing that I would have to figure out after that is the sign. And I notice I have a positive divided by a negative, and a positive divided by a negative should give me a negative answer. So my answer should be a negative 8. Okay? If I have 9 over a negative 1/7. Okay, remember, this fraction bar here is just a fancy way of saying 9 divided by a negative 1/7. And if I rewrite that, 9 divided by a negative 1/7, we really don't want to divide fractions, so this is where that rule is going to come in handy. So instead of dividing by a negative 1/7, I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal of negative 1/7. So we're just going to take that fraction and we're going to flip it upside down so it turns into a negative 7 over 1, which would just be a 7. And I just have 9 times negative 7, which gives me negative 63. Okay, another one similar to that. If I have negative 16 over negative 1/2, remember negative 16 over negative 1/2 is just another way of saying negative 16 divided by a negative 1/2, which we want to change that division sign into multiplication sign. So we're going to take negative 16 times the reciprocal of negative 1/2, which would be negative 2 over 1, and negative 16 times a negative 2 will give me a positive 32. Okay, what about negative 12 divided by a negative 6/5? Okay, so this one's not written as a fraction like the other ones were. It's already written out as a division problem for us, but instead of saying negative 12 divided by a negative 6/5, let's say negative 12 times the reciprocal of negative 6/5. So flip the whole thing over, and remember you have to carry that sign. So now I have negative 12 times a negative 5/6. Now for this one, it might be better to rewrite it and write 12 as a fraction as well. Okay, So I'm looking at negative 12 over 1 times a negative 5 over 6. If we go ahead and figure out what the sign of my answer is going to be, I have a negative times a negative, which hopefully you realize is going to give you a positive number. Once I figure out my sign, I don't have to worry about the signs in my numbers anymore. Okay, so looking to cross reduce, I can divide out a 6. So the 12 turns into a 2. Sorry, the 6 turns into a 1. So now I have a negative 2 times a negative 5, which gives me 10. 1 times 1 gives me 1. So my answer would just be a positive 10. Okay, keep moving along. Some of these problems will look like 30 times z over 15. Okay, now not really a division problem, kind of 30 times z divided by 15. But what we can do for these ones, just kind of like we did in the last one, let's rewrite this. So we have 30 over 1, and then we have z over 15. And now I'm multiplying fractions, and we want to look to cross reduce. So if I look along this diagonal here, I can divide out a 15. So the 15 turns into a 1. The 30 turns into a 2, and then we're going to multiply straight across, and I have negative 2 times z, which gives me a negative 2z. 1 times 1 gives me a 1, so my answer would just be a negative 2z. Okay, let's do another one like that. If I have negative 6 times x over 6, once again, let's rewrite this so we have both of our numbers as fractions. So put that first 6 over 1. Now I have negative 6 over 1 times x over 6. If we look to cross reduce, I can divide out a 6, and both of those 6's turn into a 1. So when I multiply straight across, negative 1 times x gives me a negative x. 1 times 1 just gives me a 1, and negative x over 1 just gives me a negative x. Okay, 2 more. Okay, I want you guys paying really close attention to these ones because these are the ones that always seem to get people. If I have negative 144a over 12. Okay, so this is negative 144a divided by 12, right? That's just what that division bar means, okay? So if we kind of disregard our variable, I could rewrite this as negative 144 over 12, and then maybe move the a out to the side because it seems to be the confusing part here. Okay, well now I have a negative 144 over 12, which is negative 144 divided by 12, which I can do that. 144 divided by 12, and I have a negative divided by a positive, which gives me a negative. And then don't forget about your variable. I have that a that's left in the numerator, so I would just have a negative 12a. Okay, don't make those ones more complicated than they are. So for the next one, if I have a negative 54x over a negative 6, first off, I have a negative divided by a negative, so I should be thinking my answer is going to be a positive number, okay? And then I have 54 divided by 6. Remember, it's just 54 divided by 6, which gives me 9. And then don't forget about that x that's still left in the numerator, which is 9x. Those ones are the simplest ones, but they seem to give people the hardest time. Okay, your homework for today is in section 2.9, page 85. And you have problems 2 through 32 even.